China English Education by Sean McHugh, May 2026. Part 1 of 5, with 800 photos by me 2006 to 2025. Firstly, me lecturing, student groups, and English signage. Then, general China. These observations in China are from 7 teaching contracts at 6 universities and a high school in 6 provinces, 2010 to 2025, where I designed, prepared, and delivered courses on the cultures of Britain, America, and Australia, public speaking, Western film, and variously on English. I was in Dongying City in Shandong Province in the east at a private high school, then at mid to high-rank universities in Zhuhai in Guangdong in the south, Nanchang in Jiangxi in the southeast, Nanning in Guangxi in the south, Nanjing in Jiangxi in the east, a second one in Nanjing, and in Tianjin City in Tianjin in the northeast. The first Nanjing contract was 5 years, although including a year and a half elsewhere during the COVID period. The Zhuhai, 2 years, and the others a year each, except Tianjin with 3 months. I also made 16 short-term travels independently or with a Chinese girlfriend in most regions of China, while I visited 100 other countries, including most bordering China, by both land and sea. I further had prior teaching experience of a year in South Korea at a college, 2008 to 2009, and in England part-time at all levels, including my local university, 2004 to 07. I have a social science bachelor's, master's, and diploma, while having begun a doctorate, studied education formally, and written extensively on compulsory and higher education. Socialism and values of society over values of individuality presuppose the state and political system as all-embracing, and hence beyond critique from those within it, and where people are structural positions rather than autonomously evaluating persons. Then adding to Chinese lines of control as mysteriously above its people, the entire modern environment has been quietly shipped in since the 1970s from Western societies, out of their exact opposite values, and set of huge historical intellectual movements of Renaissance, Scientific Revolution, Industrial Revolution, and Enlightenment, all entirely divorced from Chinese mentality and culture. Both the political system and technological background are unanalyzed by and out of reach of the population, and instead only approached on surface levels in a command economy. Scientific and engineering insight, by contrast, comes from an individual mind working on problems at a desk, and not fearful groupthink committees. But in this historical period, the government can pretend that its socialism and left-wing values are working, when everything is actually based on the products of foreign capitalism and right-wing values. Society, indeed, is the custodian of the great and varied knowledge that modern life rests on, and which is bequeathed to individuals today. But all that knowledge was arrived at in the first place only by such individuals. However, poverty is also being eradicated from China's giant population in a colossal achievement, and contrasting with the greater inequalities normalized across the West. While there's a moderately effective process of receiving students into the job market as part of their own contract with the government. The West's English language is likewise cluelessly shipped in, where its relatively simple basis, and hence limited initial study compared to other languages required to hold down a conversation, adds to the idea that it's a simple language, and with the rest of the imports, is approached with parroting rather than understanding. It's placed alongside Chinese as the only language they know, and their idea of what language in general is, when instead, English then develops enormous expressive power, precision, and range beyond Chinese culture and experience. The imports fit into socialist complacency, and the idea that everything in life is basically straightforward under the perfect political system, where criticism and any political discussion is seen as impudence rather than normal and interesting. Thinking is the government's business, and not yours, where even parroting official lines is best avoided, and instead, considered perspectives and ideas for conversation are seen as you trying to be clever to score points over people.
Students typically listen closely, but are passive and conformist, even with the lecturer visibly being a Westerner and encouraging more participation and free thought, well past the normal difficulties of speaking out to ask a question in a group, as effectively being a few moments of public speaking to be evaluated by all. When on occasion they're required to speak or make a presentation on a topic of their own, the presupposition is to choose something abjectly anodyne, particularly their hometown or foodstuffs. And in my public speaking course, I had to make a separate PowerPoint presentation on topics. Questions with curious paradoxes and ethical dilemmas, or just standard Western-style debates that make a good conversation in demanding thought and analysis, make them stare, but not break the silence. The students never ask for clarification, nor for me to explain anything again, or to check their understanding with me, as they have lower levels of understanding for anything than other groups, with their minds less conscious and based more on programmable norms, while the Western lecturer deceives themselves if they bring expectations with them. They are sheep-like, meek, and obedient because of weak innate capacity for critical appraisal and questioning, as lacking a more objective position that can issue understanding or real learning, and where this defines the conformist culture and not vice versa. Marxist and socialist theory, as further Western imports, are only theoretical outlines tacked onto an existing ancient people and culture of secondary values of society over individuality. The 20th century's emerging political polarities with West Europe and the Soviets, then the Cold War, created the People's Republic of China in 1949, but this constitutes no great imposition on China, even while values of individuality remain superior in all cases. Student questions to a teaching figure are bizarrely seen as challenging their authority and seniority, and any such very occasional questioners showing criticality and confidence may subsequently be censured by their peers for being different and disturbing the twisted idea of harmony. By contrast, great disharmony and discomfort are caused, at least in Western terms, by nobody responding, although it's out of the inability to understand, and instead their limits in copying, rather than there being no questions because they don't want to seem not to have understood. The lecturer needs to be ready to continue taking the session forward from the front and keep it engaging while finding compassion where needed, within a realistic understanding of these people, and avoid bringing Western expectations. Students don't know what to ask because they understand only surfaces and aping, and indeed, even at university, may provide torpish, self-satisfied looks in taking you for a public fool, in treating them as independent adult minds, and not just part of an automaton beehive. It's superficially annoying, but it's only fake teaching sessions in a fake education system, for fake respect, for a fake social hierarchy, as not based on understanding. English-speaking courses become impractical because opportunities for them to speak that involve any variation on "what do you think?" are met with confusion and consternation. They don't think anything about anything. Only the government or state does that. And if they did, it's not in their interests to express it. In the West, the existing social characteristics are respected only in part, because there is a level of individual critical contribution that the populace can provide, whereas in China, they're respected almost unconditionally, and with other considerations then seen as absurd. Chinese staff will provide politeness and friendly jokes to smooth over any perspectives on society from the tolerated foreigners, and get back to the zombified state of presupposed approved views and opaque groupthink. There is nothing to be coaxed from them, and hence also nothing wrong with them as they are, and instead you have to remember to be kind, and just not to spend too long with them. At most, 1 out of 400 students has the spirit to respond when I argue through regular discussion topics as having a criticality embedded in Western culture, which Westerners would respond to as appealing, even if they're not great critical thinkers.
Argumentation is seen as disruptive and impolite, and by contrast, whatever structures and bureaucracy are in place are with complete eye-rolling obviousness to be accepted.
Chinese students are more institutionalized than Western, and lack youthful rebellion, along with youth culture generally, while likewise meeting managers at a high-ranked university for coffee and then theorizing about history or culture or anything in the social sciences horrifies and mystifies them, and there is only passionlessness and stultification. China has no significant intellectual tradition, and submitting your own understanding or even misunderstanding beyond the horde and academic paradigms is almost treasonous.
However, the self-selecting students at the optional small group English conversation meetings are better, at least with topics lacking remotely controversial content. This is the most rewarding and sophisticated of teaching scenarios, in preparing more stimulating material and being mindful of everyone to bring them in. And I attended over 50 times in the Zhuhai contract. In China, knowledge is dangerous, particularly a little knowledge to be misconstrued by the little Chinese mind. And bookstores don't feature the well-stocked English sections of those in Japan or most other East and Northeast Asian countries. The stock is conservative, where books not serving empty collective materialism are suspicious and unwholesome. Bookstores in Hong Kong, as a Western influence tempering buffer zone, cannot mail to the mainland and must be carried over personally. Then, coffee shop chains, as recently spreading, may feature shelves of fake book facades as another nice-looking upmarket Western import, but where obviously no one would ever be motivated to open and read one. If you get to a sizable mainland bookstore and ask if they have any books in English, either they take you to the English language tuition section, or they'll go searching to find any book on any subject at all in English that they happen to have and hand it to you, satisfied that your request is fulfilled and you'll buy it. They don't even show you the cover or the title, but just open it to confirm it's in the English you asked for. Even bookstores don't know what a book is in terms of something interesting to read, or material providing intrinsic returns for the reader. While indeed gaining knowledge privately is disloyal, and personal edification unheard of and seditious. Books are only for rote and pompous learning, not more abstract ideas, nor even for deepening a knowledge of Chinese, while the view of learning English being just one more relatively simple task means there's no awareness that reading is essential in the process, and assimilating its progressive depth and subtlety. The highly finished and crystalline nature of its written form is also how it actually works, far more than casual speaking, such that reading improves skills in reading, but also in writing, speaking, and listening. Mentioning the book you're currently reading completely loses them, where they have no idea of books as engaging to the person, and instead are only boring, such that if someone is reading, then they're obviously studying stoically for an exam. The people and culture have limited internal life or spirit, and which segues into social control from above. The Chinese have gone from simplistic spoken language and illiteracy out of simplistic yet unwieldy writing, where characters are separate syllabic words instead of being broken into constituent sounds, to social networking technology without ever knowing the printed word as a mass cultural institution. Certainly no one is ever seen reading a book on the metro or trains, nor at a meal, while even getting pen and paper out surprises them, and instead they're only entertained by phones as toys, with lots of flickering and beeping, and seemingly never to read a book on the screen. Looking at a real book is private, thoughtful, and individualist, as leading to wider questioning and potential trouble for the social order and privilege, while in contrast, social media's worthless drivel on a phone is controlled and censored, with access to it monitored to trigger an increasing array of curbing responses from the state for various thought crimes and speech crimes as might arise. The lack of a scientific revolution or enlightenment also means that the whole process of objective reasoning by individuals operating independently of state institutions was never normalized in the cultural background. Life is presupposed as contained and muffled, not open and infinite, nor full of rich ideas and color to investigate. Trash entertainment with minimal critical distance from the audiovisual screen is far more socially acceptable and harmonious than reading a book, while trash is continuous with the lack of awareness of the complexity and detailing that Western culture and its language provide for. Both criticality and complexity are unknown, and instead there are only orders and protocol coming down an authoritarian structure, deploying copied Western technology with its provenance hidden at the apex, and then carried forward by Chinese pride. English is one of Western civilization's great achievements, with an emergent depth via syntactical intricacies and tremendous vocabulary to create unmatched descriptive reach and shades of meaning, plus rich and continuously developing metaphor, along with discreteness and differentiation to articulate and argue through vastly complex conceptual subjects. Native speakers gain an understanding of this, and hence that reading a range of texts provides essential implicit as well as explicit learning. But the Chinese are only aware of and only have the capacity for the modest levels of the equivalent features in their language.
They expect no more in English, and hence regard reading anything other than given study books as wasting time and actively discourage it. Even with the British International English Proficiency Exam, as usually taken for university entrance abroad, testing for an overall and internalized understanding and not its candidates having done whatever confused Chinese-made exercises for it. Student-led learning, and indeed any independent activity for anyone, is weakly appreciated, and sometimes anathema. The young Chinese mind is then filled with long organized study days and institutionally approved assignments, plus campus group activity as juvenile games, particularly basketball and roller skating. The Dongying School had no library apart from a poorly used few shelves in the office, which I put into order before most of the English component was removed from student access as unimportant and put for show in a reception room. Books with absorbing content of their own to get the reader's attention are necessarily against socialism, with its core notion of only the state being self-sufficient and able to stand on its own, and everything else necessarily dependent on it. Once a society's values are shifted away from the individual, its logic unfolds into a raving lunatic asylum. Chinese study books, by contrast, are piled on each student's desk to look studious, but crazily taking up the space, rather than stored in lockers or bags. Then gains from literacy are less appreciated when reading means laboriously memorizing thousands of similar logographic characters standing for whole words, instead of only 26 phonetic letters for all words. And this feat of memory remains a focus of the reading process, rather than any content or critical analysis beneath surfaces. The writing also doesn't give the words sounds, or how to say them, and only meanings, although this at least means that ancient texts are more readable than in English, as they can be automatically translated into the present dialect or language, and aren't specific to a particular linguistic historical time. In English, written words are overall symbols, despite also being comprised of individual phonetic symbols, where the reader can know the visual phonetic string patterns so they don't have to calculate them out. But if they don't know them, they can also work out their likely pronunciation while noting roots and various prefix and suffix extensions. A phonetic system's inner but foregroundable construction then connotes looking beneath surfaces and making evaluations in terms of deeper truths via intellectual thinking and transparency, all of which, however, are seen by Chinese English learners as mysterious Western culture-specific notions that they don't have to worry about in their study, and nothing important which they're lacking. Making claims, giving evidence and reasoning, using logic and avoiding fallacy, and saying why you think what you think are all disharmonious and negated by Chinese culture and language, and instead, all learning and education are surface symbolism and empty parroting, issuing from zombies. Moreover,
Language's complexity is assimilated by direct engagement on more intuitive levels, not by study of grammatical structures on outward conceptual levels. Yet, when I recommend a famous novel or book of some thought-provoking subject area to students, I'm asked how they should study it or how it's useful. They don't have the same mental capacity for gaining subtle understanding as motivated by curiosity for the content, and instead compare with trying to learn to swim or drive only from studying books about these. As the language isn't phonetic and its sounds can't be read, and instead only copied from existing speakers, the listen and repeat formula of primary schooling, where personal sense-making isn't expected, then scarcely changes throughout the rest of society. Accordingly, there is a lack of alarm not only over brainless verbatim memorizing generally, but plagiarism, even at university. They think nothing of cheating, because learning and assessment as such is anyway focused on copying, not understanding, and so copying published work as their own, or copying each other, is as good as copying the instructor. Moreover, the whole society as only copying Western technology, and not earning it for itself, doesn't have the same sense of responsibility towards it, while complaints of international intellectual copyright violation are common. If possible, students will swap assessment answers around via phones, as then being obvious during marking when incorrect, but otherwise unreproducible answers are found many times. The most that these sequestered people and their alien modern society can do is grabbing, and they have limited sense of such behavior as pathetic and demeaning. Moreover, students looking for a high grade for a course as part of applications for further courses may email me asking for it during the grading period. Rather than personal understanding, the Chinese store knowledge in the overall bureaucracy and then blindly follow its dispatches. Action takes place under respect for instructions, rather than any enthusiasm arising from seeing for oneself what to do, where an even lower proportion of people are endowed with charisma issuing from critical insight than Westerners, and with reasons generally being alien to Chinese culture. Then in public speaking, they struggle badly with the basic technique of learning notes in abstraction, as only their content or meaning or ideas, and not moronically word for word, to then speak freely and explain in any way that comes to mind at the time, after glancing at an illustrating PowerPoint slide as a prompt. Most students are amazed and dumbfounded at examples of speaking in endless possible ways to say the same learnt information, and most never understand this process, regardless of their intelligence in terms of outward rationality or how much I explain, including with practical presentations I make. Most only strive to be an actor, where all words are memorized. But with much wrong-headed, crazy practice, they can at least begin to look natural, as then likewise fitting into the society where everything is a facade. They lack Western capacity for internally cognized meaning and the transcendent lively understanding of consciousness, and have only the outward information processing of computers, where for information to be stored, they need the whole text to be fed in and retained in the memory. With minimal inner awareness, students can't explain the public speaking slides, or anything at all, while their paraphrasing in writing is poor when summarizing a source, and instead, across China are seen early morning on campuses, wandering about reciting verbatim to themselves some bunk they've been given. As the PRC's history has made clear, rather than people with intuitive common sense, they are as programmable as robots and can be made to behave with any insanity and self-destruction. Accordingly, socialism assumes there is no personally internalized understanding or mental independence away from the collective, and where society comprises only an emptiness to be directed by either a monarchical or governmental strong central authority. People's responses generally are streamlined under brooding and boneheaded concerns for concord between themselves rather than individual self-expression, and under the all-pervasive, unhealthy pall over the entire boring, passionless country. China, with its conditioning and fear, will never be a threat to the West, with its greater sensitivity to truth, despite its similar tendencies towards excess reasoning and overthinking. Furthermore, regardless of people's names being important and due respect, the Chinese are happy to choose a joke or nonsense or random word for an English name, such as hungry, monster, brilliant, or money, explaining, sometimes against my better judgment, that these are ridiculous and demeaning. They ignore or squint at me in trying to assume I don't know what I'm talking about, although producing a Western book of established first names piques their interest a little. Also, in formal settings, people may be introduced as handsome, beautiful, or cute, all in line with appearances being more important than such individuals having something to say, and where anything important is only from the recognized authority and state above. The person is a know-nothing nobody who is patted on the head and then slotted into a brick-in-the-wall role. Similarly, native English speakers won't walk around with gibberish and foolishness written across their clothing, but it's just fine for the Chinese, not suspecting nor looking for much meaning in a written language. For them, garments with English words are just fashionably indicating Western script, where writing isn't an articulation of thought, and instead something secondary to casual speech, even though the unseriousness also rightly indicates the Western overemphasis on intellectual and linguistic processes. During contracts, the greater number of courses of different kinds that a lecturer has, the higher their preparation workload, at least if they're new to them, whereas repeating the same course is easier, if less interesting, while regular reading, writing, listening, and speaking English courses are easier and can be kept engaging by a range of visual PowerPoint material built on file. However, the management consistently show much ignorance and glib whitewashing, particularly towards the demands of the full semester 18-week lecture presentation courses for introducing Western countries' cultures. They neither know nor care about the extensive work and skills for making a secure and engaging course, and often indicate this in not even bothering to ensure you're assigned a teaching room with the right equipment before you have to arrange changes yourself, if it's even possible by then. In socialism, efforts and high standards an individual produces are less recognized, and instead you're a structural position that just does what you're supposed to and ignored. Culture courses and other social sciences and humanities content courses should determine key areas of discussion and debate, identify established relevant books and other library or internet resources for course material, and create corresponding weekly student reading lists with page numbers. Then, prepare the weekly 100-slide PowerPoint presentations of carefully researched and paraphrased basic text to follow, interspersed with quality images to further explain, plus vocabulary and concluding translation lists. Within this are audiovisual material and internet links, along with a diverse range of other lecturer-led material, along with summaries and critical questions against the session and readings. This is the international standard and requires an enormous undertaking of hundreds of hours of work from someone qualified in the subject area, skilled and experienced in preparation and delivery, and hard-working and conscientious throughout. Meanwhile, the students need support from a good study skills course, which their glossing over departments always lack, and where I have to try to find time to check they have the basics of researching and writing essays. It's a culture of botching and papering over, while all education systems as social institutions are anyway only quietly for shepherding and conditioning to fit people into and serve the wider employment and power hierarchy. Meanwhile, staff are typically told of the university's major events or conferences for them to participate in at short notice, or not at all, out of a default dismissiveness and derision towards everyone. China has a thoroughly cloaked need-to-know culture, not an open learning culture. And while Western systems have similar problems, their individualism means learning is understood as more than a subset of wider social organization. Real education with personal edification is opposed to socialist order and people control, and must be carefully shielded, particularly from occasional more critical minds who could make changes to the existing social order, and away from simpler minds getting more aimlessly troubled. Much of the time, however, neither management nor local or foreign staff have the profile or caliber to care much about issues of teaching or the environment, and instead, this segues into treating students like they're in primary school, where a teacher provides a much more generalized level of expertise with lower expectations. As in the West, the entire process is corrupted under the state education institution's function of keeping people down, while avoiding foregrounding basic questions of what is taught and how that could rock the privilege hierarchy. Indeed, the overwhelming Chinese concern is treating adult students as no more than the children they are, and presupposing higher education as being no such thing, and only a seamless part of the school system, with its unremitting deference to authority figures, masquerading as help from teachers. In communism elsewhere, there is consternation over families, with their natural lateral allegiance away from the state. But here, the attention to children and making adult life equally childlike are promoted, while the main worry is for people operating alone and giving themselves space to think, and then associating with like-minded others.
The overarching symbol in China is the baby, where its total dependence on adults translates to adults in the same way totally dependent on the state. Adults, by definition, take personal responsibility, whereas for the Chinese, this is to a minimum, in line with their nature.
Students are fee-paying within a relationship with professionals. And if you have much humanity, you're concerned to keep to ethical basics and do what you can for them and be well thought of, even while mentally bracketing off the environment's distortion of the learning process, along with its subject area's often weird pre-existing paradigms to keep to. There are ongoing questions of how far a neurotically structured institution can be suited to real learning, and hence what its subsurface function is. While for the first few months of taking in a new environment and the culture shock, there is added tiredness and irritability. There is a disjunction between the central government policy of employing foreign experts and local Chinese in the institution uneasy about making gestures of inclusion to those outside the power hierarchy's internal selection system, and who have alien ways and ideas, even with exposure to these being part of their reason for being there. The management are required to employ Westerners, and are interested in them as cosmopolitan contacts from relatively successful countries, and are polite in wanting to keep them happy so they don't leave and bring the management trouble. But they don't entirely like them, and put up multiple soft barriers, including minimizing their input and the use they make of them.
There is typically only a surface of pleasantries, while more critical conversations that make a friendship meaningful and worthwhile are beyond them anyway, even allowing for the flatness and depthlessness in second language use in a different culture as having lost its home cultural background.
Then, in taking English as unduly simple, they often don't see why native speakers should be regarded as foreign experts, nor why they're needed at all. I have a strong native command of the language, with a personal interest in it, including voluminous writings and maintaining extensive writings and vocabulary files. But rather than staff and students queuing up for help, the concern stays with me just filling the official timetabled sessions, which, as with all imposed study, become routine and inefficacious. There may be dozens of Chinese English language staff, but they don't initiate friendly, professional meetings with native speakers, asking them to take a look through material for a second opinion, or for their advice on anything at all. The unfolding richness of English as beyond Chinese, and their notion of what language in general isn't understood, and instead there is only benighted ego over personal achievements that they've made with it so far. The government requires institutions to include courses taught in English and variously introduce Western culture, yet in practice, on site, there is tension between the Westerners' deeper culture and language with their expectations, and the Chinese carrying on purely in their terms. The modern world, purely out of the West's fabulous intellectual and technological achievements over the last few centuries, contrasts violently with Chinese history. When the West had reached the space age a few decades ago, China was still in a medieval subsistence farming condition and one of the world's poorest countries. For the management, Westerners are there to furnish only well-mannered comments on a presupposed perfect, but in fact fractured education system, if indeed aligned with Western equivalents. We're typically ignored and treated in the administrative pyramid on a compartmentalized basis, just above the janitors, and usually with no meetings or mechanism for making changes. You're expected to be a compliant proletariat, like everyone else, just waiting for orders from above. And for a thinking person, it becomes an unhealthy vortex of repressed concerns and anxiety. There's scarcely recognition of the basic pedagogical need for tutors being aware of how their courses fit into students' degrees or wider goals, or how the department fits into the institutional structure. Knowledge and transparency are opposed to the culture. With schooling and university on all levels there not to advance, but control these by subtly institutionalizing ignorance and obfuscation, particularly via notions of harmony as avoiding questioning, for purposes of the power holders in wider society. The West is similar, but China is more blatant and obvious, and less nuanced about it. The consciousness for uncovering better ways of doing things beyond the state-driven internal network of rationale isn't there, and hence any differences of view with Westerners are seen at most as opinion-based, and to be laughed off as uppity and silly. Again, the idea of expertise as anyone above the communist herd level and state-given perspectives causes unease, while the Han Chinese set of ethnic psychological characteristics has more consistency than those of whites, with personalities more narrowly defined. The ignorance in Chinese English teaching staff of Western expertise is exampled by them blithely missing the whole closed nature of sentences, with their starts and finishes, as giving rise to discrete ideas, differentiation, and comparing and contrasting. These then provide for conceptual working, reasoning, and argumentation to make more objective sense of the world, beyond the crazed neurosis of socialist state-given authority in disjunction from reality, and subsequent horrendous disasters such as the Great Leap Forward and Cultural Revolution. Full stops aren't understood and poorly articulated in handwriting, with dots and assorted confused marking always scattered everywhere. Writing is in the casual phrases of speaking, with punctuation brought over from Chinese writing, including commas and stops positioned midway between words and stops positioned midway between words and raised up from the line. They're unaware of the greater distance between written and spoken English than between written and spoken Chinese, while their reading aloud is robotic, without looking ahead for phrasing and shaping, down to pauses and stops, with subtle subclauses and minor pauses in sentences lost on them. Their idea is that a language is defined by its spoken rather than written form, and thus the range of imprecise and casual utterances in speaking, as required to make the listener understand, translates to the same in writing. The remarkable precision and mental focus emergent in written English is unknown, while their endless errors, low quality, and meaninglessness are not taken to be such. They manage all over China to have no clue that English must be in demarked sentences with commas inside and not more stops and phrasal vagary. In speaking, if the listener doesn't understand, the speaker can explain in another way. But in writing, if the reader doesn't understand, then it has failed, and by contrast must be accurate and self-contained. Again, this contrasts with socialism, where only the state is self-contained, and everything else only pertains to it and doesn't develop its own independence. The lack of closure further compares with the tones of Chinese words at the end of phrases that may rise rather than fall, and hence disrupt the notion of sentence cohesion, instead aligning with cultural stasis and stultifyingly uniform socialist-style interconnections, while also congruent with the blithe onward material development. A spectacular 100 million Chinese students of the International Common Language don't know what a full stop does, and only approach English on the surface level of spoken Chinese, all alongside the surface understanding of the rest of imported modernity from more complex cultures, and instead it's command culture to deal with it. In English handwriting, there is also no understanding that the pen must be moved to make the full stop, and not just touch it to the paper for a barely visible mark. And there are even course books where someone has benightedly replaced all the full stops of the font with a smaller and hence fainter font to make it look like the insane handwriting across the country. There's an undertone of willful aversion to international standard English, as this pertains to a wealth of thought beyond the culture. And instead trying to say anything different appearing in Chinese English, no matter how corrupted and meaningless, is just a matter of local style or dialect, and I shouldn't worry. China has the neurosis and double standards of its ancient and valuable culture of stasis, moderation, and inclusion, yet fear of the West, and quietly importing its technology and intimately related language, yet without properly understanding anything. The greatly enhanced material life impinging at this time isn't earned by them and remains mysterious, but also unserious and fun, while English is learnt only to the level of complexity in Chinese language and society, with nothing further presupposed to exist. Chinese English teachers' total confidence in a page of simplistic drivel English is a spectacle, asking, "What's wrong with it?" while laughing incredulously at me as I politely try to tell them. The government in dealing with the West gains the understanding that native speakers are needed to assist, but locals with parochial life experience then need plenty of patience and kindness from us. Managers and Chinese staff either defensively choose not to ask us to check learning materials or anything else they prepare in English, or it just doesn't occur to them that it needs checking by anyone, as it's all assumed to be a simple matter. Instead of the obvious authority I'm paid to provide, they'll cite justifying sources, such as dictionary definitions for a word in completely the wrong context, or some low-grade Chinese English publication. They struggle with words' subtleties of use and coloration, punching the brute Chinese character into translation software, where whatever English word comes up is obviously right, then disbelieve you when you explain, and can easily get offended in being used to language with limited emotional expression, including humor, where at this point it may be wiser to nod in acquiescence. At Zhuhai, I said that the Chinese prepared English exams were substandard and needed replacing with exams by a native speaker, or correcting by a native speaker, where I spent several hours doing this for them in the manager's office, but was told that this can't be allowed because the Chinese writer would be offended. They didn't understand, nor could be coaxed into understanding there was a problem, so the hell with hundreds of fee-paying students in our professional care for being mistreated in trying in vain to make sense of wildly wrong-headed questions and nonsense. To be continued. Any questions?